This is an NVIDIA RTX 4060, a $299 graphics card, the Asus Dual model. And this is the very same RTX 4060 playing Diablo 4 at 4K ultra settings and getting over 60 frames per second. I was utilizing DLSS on the quality setting and frame generation, but to the naked eye, the visuals looked exactly the same as playing it at 4K native, and quite impressively, it was able to handle over 60 frames on a $299 GPU. So today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 4060, comparing it up against the RX 7600, which recently released from AMD at also an MSRP of $299. Now, admittedly, that card has come down a little bit in price, as AMD has had some trouble shipping units on the RX 7600. NVIDIA also has seen some similar issues by the looks of things with the RTX 4060 Ti. So hopefully the 4060 maybe could be a decent card that comes out at a decent value and, you know, represents something that fills a niche for certain gamers out there. I do think, you know, probably people coming from like 1060s and older generations is probably really what this is going to be targeting and marketing towards. Obviously, people on a 3060 aren't going to be looking to upgrade in the very next generation, but we'll be taking a look at this card here today at 1080p and 1440p, although I do really think 1080p is going to be the sweet spot here, just like it was for the RX 7600. And let's be honest, probably not utilizing ray tracing in a lot of titles, so we are going to be focusing on rasterized performance. But of course, you know, with ray tracing and stuff, there will be some games where you can use it, some games where you can't, but almost certainly you'll have to use some sort of upscaling like DLSS or potentially even frame generation in the handful of titles that that's available in. But thankfully, it is something that is becoming more common and something that you could use on the 4060, whereas on the 7600, you could not. So with that out of the way, let's just go ahead and jump straight into the numbers, and we'll take a look at 1080p first here at ultra settings, no ray tracing used, as I said, and of course I'm testing on my 7950X rig with should be no CPU bottlenecks or any limitations there. It's got 32 gigabytes of DDR5 memory at like 6,000 megahertz or something. It's just a crazy fast system, so I don't think we'll be seeing any CPU bottlenecks here on the $300 roughly price cards here. So as always, I like to start off with Warzone 2, one of the biggest titles out there, very popular. You can see that the 4060 and the 7600 are very, very close here, and that is the case in a lot of the titles, but not all of them. Some of them are very, very neck and neck. And AMD does also, unsurprisingly, win out in Far Cry 6. That is just one title that it's sponsored by them, and it's totally optimized for AMD cards, and it just traditionally has run better when tested against comparable hardware. But Warzone 2, we get a slight edge out here on the 4060 at 85 FPS versus 83. Of course, the 4060 Ti is going to be at the top of these charts, but I did want to include that for people that, are considering, should I spend an extra $100 and go out and get the 4060 Ti versus, the 4060, and that's something you might want to weigh as an option there. And Cyberpunk's 2077, again, NVIDIA only holds a small lead there of about 4 frames per second, but that was consistent there. Horizon Zero Dawn, 119 to 103. We already mentioned Far Cry 6, where the 7600 is actually even almost matching the 4060 Ti. That's how well that game runs for AMD cards. So if you're just all about Far Cry 6, then AMD might be the way to go for you. Guardians of the Galaxy, that is a game, it's the exact opposite of Far Cry 6, where it totally runs better on NVIDIA hardware traditionally, getting an average of 144 FPS, which is awesome, especially if you're on a 1080p 144 hertz display, compared to the 108 of the RX 7600. So that's a pretty big stomping there. On Returnal, we get 84 versus 70, a nice decent uptick over the 7600. It's not like margin of error. That's a pretty significant lead. And I would say the same here again for the Callisto Protocol, which is actually an AMD sponsored title, which only has FSR, which sucks. No DLSS in that game because it could use it for some of the low frame times in that title. But NVIDIA wins out here considerably at 81 FPS versus 55. Not bad. And Watch Dogs Legion finishes up in a virtual tie with NVIDIA only winning by 1 frame. And I'll go ahead and throw up the 1% lows here now, which shows nothing really too shocking, which includes Callisto Protocol, again, pulling up the rear with some pretty bad 1% lows, as that game just has some bad optimization issues. Again, I do feel could be helped, with something like with frame generation or something like that, but it just sadly doesn't support it as it's an AMD-sponsored title. But in the 1% lows, AMD really does tank harder even than NVIDIA in this one, which, again, surprising. It's an AMD-sponsored title, but NVIDIA wins out 36 to 19 there in the 1% lows. Pretty crazy to see that, but with all the other numbers, nothing really too surprising. Moving things over to 1440p, which I do not really think is an area where this card is targeting, but that doesn't mean it won't be able to handle some titles at 1440p, especially if you consider using upscaling. It will probably be able to handle most games at 1440 with upscaling, but at native resolution, I think it's going to be a struggle in a lot of more demanding titles. As you can see here, like with Cyberpunk, Warzone 2, again, that's a competitive shooter. That's something you really want to be over 60 frames, so for something like that, you're going to want to stick to 1080p or utilize one of the built-in upscalers that the game does have if you're looking to play at 1440p or maybe even at 1080p, just so that you can get the most frames that you possibly can in a title like that. Far Cry 6 here, the 4060 actually wins out at 1440p, so it seems like the 4060 is actually handling maybe the bigger frame buffer a little bit better than 7600, maybe with their caching system or something, but it seems like with the higher resolution that they actually pulled ahead here against AMD in Far Cry 6, which is interesting to see. Horizon Zero Dawn, we also get a slight edge out there. Guardians of the Galaxy went out by 13 frames per second on the 4060. Returnal is pretty close, almost margin of error type stuff, only 4 frames apart. We do get a pretty big lead there in Callisto Protocol again for NVIDIA, winning 60 to 48. And we get a deadlock tie in Watch Dogs Legion, which is close to what we saw at 1080p, where they'd only won by 1 frame. And here again, we get the 1% lows. This is for 1440p, so if you want to go ahead and skim through those, pretty similar to what we saw as far as scaling is concerned with 1080p. Again, Callisto Protocol just putting up some rough 1% lows. Really wish that game had some better tech in there and got some better updates and optimization from the devs as well as the driver teams, and just can figure out a way to get that game running better, because it's a gorgeous looking game. It just has a lot of performance issues, sadly. So that's all the benchmarks we got for the 4060 and the 7600 4060 Ti. So where do I see this card really fitting in? It's coming in, like I said, both the 7600 and the 4060 are both coming in around that $300 price point, and the 7600 has come down a little bit, and we might see that again with the 4060 as well. The areas where I think, again, we've talked about this yesterday with everything with the AMD and their anti-competitive stuff with FSR and some of the limitations of that, as it is a software-based solution for a hardware problem, which as NVIDIA addressed years ago, bringing in things like AI tensor cores to be able to handle DLSS and stuff, which is why it is just, better. And then we've got frame generation. We're still waiting to see on FSR 3. So for me, and also just because of the fact that in pure rasterization performance, as you saw there, in the majority of titles, NVIDIA was winning. In some titles, it was closer than others, but across the board, it was pretty clear victory, I think, for the RTX 4060 at a similar price point. And you're also getting a little bit more tech with an RTX 4060, and let's be honest, better drivers. AMD has tons of driver issues, have had them for years, and they continue to have them. And then, for the people that shop at this price point, I mean, you think about who's the 4060 for. People that bought a 3060 a couple of years ago, they're not looking to get a 4060 right now. People that buy cards like that hold on to them for a considerable amount of time. But for people that are on like a 1050 Ti, 1060, 1650, people in that price bracket, I think this would be the kind of card they would be looking at to potentially upgrade to if they're not going to be jumping up a tier to something like the 4070 or the 4060 Ti potentially. I feel like this is the card that people on a few generations behind would maybe be looking to go for. And that extra tech of the DLSS and the frame generation could also potentially be a selling point, because for people that are holding onto these cards for 3 to 5 years, something like frame generation could maybe breathe an extra year of life into that card, as it will only continue to get adopted by more and more titles as we move forward. And eventually, I'm sure FSR 3 will be available, and we'll see how that is at that time. But, this is no secret. If you look over on the Steam hardware surveys at, the most popular cards here, we're talking a few generations old for the most part. The 1650, the 1060. In the number 3 spot, we actually have the 3060 with 4.73% of Steam users. And before that, we have the 2060. We've got 3060 laptop, 1050 Ti. So the majority of like these top 5, 6, 7 cards or so are a couple of generations old. So most people, in the current market, they're not going out and buying a card every single year. It's not like 3090 owners who before that, had 2080 Ti's or whatever, or Titans, and then bought 4090s, and people like me that, upgrade every single generation because we like to have the newest and coolest stuff. People that are holding on to them for multiple years, frame generation, I think, is going to start to make a lot more sense for those people, so that they can just hang on to those cards for longer before they need to upgrade. So like I said, I'm just giving you all the information, my kind of thought process on this. I'm not really a buyer at the $300 price point, but these are things that I would consider when shopping for a card. It's winning in rasterize. We didn't do ray tracing here because honestly, we don't need to. AMD is so far behind in ray tracing, it has become laughable at this point and almost no point in testing it. NVIDIA wins with DLSS. It's significantly better than FSR in every single way. NVIDIA also has frame generation. FSR 3 at this point is nothing but a dream and a hope. We haven't seen it. We don't know if it's going to be good. I expect it to be about as good as FSR, which is to say not good at all. So that's where we sit here in 2023. Call me an NVIDIA shill. Call me whatever you want. I always look forward to the comments as always. This is my honest opinion, as always, reporting to you guys, and I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I'll catch you guys next time for another video. Peace.